Hello, my Padawan low-code developer, and welcome to the latest video in the Wized beginner series. On your way to becoming a low-code Jedi Master, you are going to be learning about CRUD, how to create, read, update, and delete records in a backend service. And we're going to kick it off today with Airtable. So with CRUD, what are we creating? Typically, we are creating a record or an entry in a database. Now that record can represent any number of things. A user, a transaction that a user has paid for via Stripe, an application to complete a certificate, an answer that they submit to a question in a learning management system. It can be anything at all that you could create a database to store. Let's jump right into it. So we are going to pick up where we left off with our AI story generator. Now, a quick note on how to use these videos. You don't have to be following along with this course exactly as I am to learn from these videos. You might have something else set up and just want to learn how to do CRUD with Airtable. These videos will be done in such a way that you can still learn how to do that. If you are following along with the tutorial beginner series from start to finish, we're going to be using this AI story generator for some time. All you need to be able to do with it is get a response back from any sort of AI tool. It doesn't even need to be an AI tool. You just need some request that brings back data into Wized. And what we're going to do is store that data inside of Airtable. So here's the current state of my application. Nothing has changed in Webflow or Wized since we last looked at this. And at the minute, if we go over to Wized, what this does is lets us put in a story prompt, select the randomness or temperature and the number of characters, and we can generate our story. I want to store a couple of pieces of information inside of Airtable. So if you're new to Airtable, what you can do is sign up for an account and you're going to get something that looks like this. You can create a workspace, which is where you will organize your Airtable projects or your Airtable bases as they're called. So you'll want to create a workspace, and inside of that workspace, you'll want to click create, and that's going to create a base, is what we call these in Airtable. If I click into it, it's going to open the base. Inside of the base, we can have tables. So this is like how you can have multiple sheets in Google Sheets or multiple, are they called sheets in Excel? I'm not sure what they're called in Excel. The different tables and sheets that you can have. We just need one. I'm going to call mine stories. Then, similar to a database or to a spreadsheet, we have a number of columns that set the type of information we're going to store. Inside of Airtable, when we make a new column or new field, we can select the field type, and there are a variety of these. What I will be storing is the following. The first is the name. I will probably just put in the first line of the story or the prompt. The prompt is what we are entering in here. I want to save that. I want to also save the model that I'm using. Now in the current setup, the model doesn't change. In the future, it might, and I want to be able to capture that. I want to also capture the temperature and the max tokens that the user selected. I want to capture the date that they first ran this, and I also want to capture and store the response. So you can go through those by clicking the plus icon, putting in the name of the field, and selecting the field type. We have long text here. This is for multiple lines of text. Model is short or a single line text. Temperature and max tokens are numbers. Created is a specific field called created time. This will populate itself. And response is long text. Next, let's go back over to Wized and link this up. Over on the left-hand side, I'm going to go to apps and I'm going to click plus. In the previous video, we covered a list of applications that have native integrations in Wized. Airtable is one of these, and I'm just going to call this Airtable. Then you're going to get the option to connect Airtable. And when we do that, it's going to ask us to grant access to Wized. I'm going to then select which bases it's going to have access to. It's a good security measure, even though there's nothing wrong with Wized or Airtable. It's still a good security measure to only grant the minimum access required. In that case, that would just be my base here. Wized, grok, story generator, and grant access. We'll see that appear over here. Enable authentication we don't need for now, and we'll cover in a later video. So now Airtable is connected as an app. What we need is a single request to send information to Airtable. So now that I have the app, I can go into requests and I can click create on the plus icon. I'm going to call this Airtable create story record. In many backend tools, such as Xano, the API endpoints follow this naming convention, lowercase with underscores. So we'll do the same in Wized, and you'll notice that it will actually enforce this, like so. It won't enforce the lower cases, it'll put in the underscores. I'm going to go with lowercase. I'm going to create a new folder just to keep this tidy. I'll call it story CRUD. We'll have more requests in here later. And for app, I'm going to select Airtable. Next up, it's going to ask us, what do you want to do with Airtable? And this is where CRUD starts to come in. Create item is our C in CRUD. Get item or a list of items is our read. That's where we're reading the Airtable base or the backend or the database to pull information into Wized. Update is where we change an existing record inside the database, and delete is deleting it. Let's go with create. Next, it's going to ask me to select my base. I only added one, so that's going to appear here. And it'll ask me to select a table inside that base. Again, I only have one called stories. Then, because there is a native integration with Wized, we are automatically going to see a list of all of the fields that we have in Airtable, and very useful, it's also going to tell us which type we assign to it. So now we need to go through these one by one and map the correct data. So for the name, I want to use the prompt, but I don't want the prompt to be longer than 30 characters. And I want it to trim it down to 30 characters without breaking any words. And I wanted to add ... at the end. I'm a big fan of using AI, so I'm going to show you how I would go about this. I would go over to ChatGPT and I would say, I need JavaScript to take a string and cut it down to 30 characters, but not break the final word. Do it in such a way that it doesn't break words and adds ... to the end, with the ... not counting towards the 30 characters. ChatGPT is going to spit out the JavaScript for us, and we're going to need to change it a little bit. What I'm going to do is click copy, go back over here, and I can click either the box here or the expand icon to open our function editor. And I'm going to remove that return statement and paste that in. So we have a function here, and we're not going to worry too much about what the function does. As you get along in your no-code career, you'll learn more and more JavaScript and be able to understand how this works. But what it's doing is creating a function where we can pass in the string or the text and the max length. And then we can run it by calling the function name, putting in the string and the max length. So it's giving us this example text. I don't want that. So I'm going to change this to say text equals, I'm going to remove that sample, and I'm going to go up to my data store, go into F for forms. I'm going to find my story prompt, and I'm going to put that in there. Okay. So then we have the result, and I want to change example to text, and I'm going to leave the 30 there. Console log would log this inside the console. And just in case you're not familiar, the way you get to the console, in Chrome anyways, similar in most browsers, you go to inspect. That's going to bring up this lovely bar at the side, which you are going to become very familiar with in your low-code journey. We will have video tutorials covering this. The console is where we get all sorts of information, errors and warnings, and we can use this to log information to here. Very useful for debugging. I'm going to close that. What I want to do is just return this. We don't need the brackets, but we can keep them there as well. And if I run this, we're going to get a story about a storm. It's under 30 characters, so it's not going to truncate it. It's not going to shorten it. Let's close that. We'll test that out later on. Make sure it's working. Next up is prompt. Very simple. We have our return statement. Open up the data store. It's open from where I had it last time. We just want to return the prompt. Nice and simple. For the model, let's go into requests, story generator, Grok create story, and we have our model in here. So we don't want to have to change this twice. If we change this later on, or if we give the user the option to change it, we'll have to change it in Airtable as well. So let's be clever about this. Reduce the amount of work that we have to do in the future. We're going to go into the data store, and we are going to open up the general tab and create a variable. And we're going to name this variable Grok model. And I really should have copied that. So back to requests, back down to body, back to model, and this time copy it. Close out, back over to the data store, into the model, initial value, return in quotes. We want it to be a string. Return the name of the model. We do not need this to persist in storage, and we do not need to compute it. Back over into our request for Grok create story, down past the headers, into the body, into model, and we are going to remove this and type v.grok model, and we can test that by running it in the top right. Perfect. Okay, now back into our Airtable create request, and we'll go down to model and now return the same thing. And very simply, when we change that variable once, it will change throughout our application. Temperature, again, very straightforward. Into the data store and select the randomness or temperature. Now, I think there will be an issue here. This is a string. As we saw in the previous video, you might remember that we had to change this to an integer, and we have it down as an integer in Airtable. I'm going to leave it because I'm actually curious to see if Airtable will change this over automatically. So let's leave it like that, but just make a mental note to come back to it. Max tokens, again, also very simple. Into the data store, max tokens. This is a number. It doesn't have strings inside it, so there shouldn't be any issues there. Create it. This is asking us to, it's appearing here rather as a field. I'm not sure. Do we need to enter the created date here? If we do, we'll look at how to do that with JavaScript. I don't think so, so I'm going to leave it blank. And now for the response. So for the response, we will go into the data store, into requests, and we can't see where the data is because we haven't run this. So two options. One, we could run it and get the data from here. The other option is we close the function editor. So let's go to elements and go to our result text. And you'll recall from the previous tutorial that we were setting this to plain text and we were returning the response from our request here. So let's copy that out of the function editor back over to our Airtable create story request and go down to our response and pop that in there. Okay. Before we automate this, or before we create an event so that this request fires or runs every time we create a story, let's test it inside of here. So let's generate a story. And up here, we can change over to our log panel that shows response, logs, and an overview. We can expand down the response panel and we can run this and see what happens. So again, a little hard to read this. Let's open this up in its own mini data store. This is a new feature where you can dig into a response and get it in a bigger panel. Okay. At path, no idea what that means. Haven't a clue. Expected a string, but received 500. Okay, so where do we have 500 entered? We have 500 entered inside max tokens. And it says it expected a string. So it looks like this is actually the other way around. Even though these are number fields inside of Airtable, it seems to want them as a string. Let's go back over to Airtable. And we can actually hover over this and see that it is indeed a number. So we may have to change our 500 number to a string. Worth pointing out, this is not the error message that I was expecting. I would expect the name of the column, max tokens, to be in here, and I don't see it. And I'm not sure why Airtable is not including that information. That would be very useful for debugging. Alas, we developers must work with what we have. So we'll close out of the data editor and go back over to editing the request and down to max tokens. So again, if you're new to JavaScript, this is where AI tools come in handy. Ask it how you convert an integer or a number to a string. As you start to pick up JavaScript, you'll get familiar with some of these functions. In this case, we do dot to string. And you'll notice that the function editor is clever. It knows what all of these functions are in JavaScript, so it can autocomplete many of them for us. What I won't tell you is that we need to put 2 brackets here at the end. So we can test this by running it up here. Before I do that, have a think to help solidify your learning. What should I see appear here? And the answer is we should see 500 not as a number, an integer, but as a string surrounded by quotes. Let's test this. We'll close out of the function editor, refresh our canvas. We will generate a story. There was a big storm here in Ireland. That's why storms is popping up at the top of my mind. Select the randomness and enter 500 again. Generate story. Go over to our log for our Airtable request and run it and see what we get back. We got back a success. We know that for a couple of reasons. The first is the status text is success. The status, which is usually a number, is 200. 200 means success. And OK is true and not false. It also returns some data. In the previous video, when we looked at backends, we saw that in Xano we can create inputs, the functions that happen, and the output. Outputs are where we set what we get back in the response. So Airtable, in their software, have set it up so that when we create a record like this via the API, we are going to get an ID for the record, the time it was created at, and it will also tell us which fields we have. So, a few interesting things to note. The first is that temperature and max tokens do come back as integers. So we have now learnt a useful piece of information. Even when we have fields as numbers in Airtable, we need to submit them as strings. We also see that the created date came back. So I was correct in assuming that we didn't need to do that inside of Wized. Airtable was going to create that for us. Now, from a technical perspective, We are still working with the Airtable API here. What has happened is that there's an integration in Wized for Airtable that does this work for us. So it's more low-code work being done for us in the background. Let's go over to Airtable and check that this is correct. A story about a storm for the name and the prompt. Let's stress test that in a moment. We have the name of our model, the temperature and max tokens look correct, and we also have our response. Let's link this up as an event and test this again. Back over to Wized, close out of the function editor. What we need is an event. Over in events, we are going to create our first one, and that's going to open the event panel over on the right. I am going to call this Add Story to Airtable. I'm going to create a folder called Story plus Airtable. Save that. Now we need to pick our trigger. We have a couple of options here. Custom condition is going to let us completely set up our trigger with JavaScript. Attribute present means an event will run if a particular Wized attribute is present on the screen, on the page. Not going to work for us. Request finishes is what we want. We want this to run when our request to Grok finishes. Page starts loading, page finishes loading, fairly self-explanatory. Let's go with request finishes. That is going to ask us which requests. We are going to select Grok create story. You'll have seen this in a previous video, is conditional. Do we want to make this conditional? What do you think, dear viewer? The answer is yes. We do not want to try adding a story to Airtable if we get back an error from our story generation request. So we will tick this and we will click into condition. What we want to do is go up to our data store and we want to close this request to Airtable and look inside our Grok create story. We want to go down to our request response information and I want to check that it's okay. So to quickly go back over this kind of logic, this is going to return this value. If the request is not okay, it will return false and this event will not run. If it comes back as true, the event will run. So we will close this. Now that we have set our trigger, we need to set an action. So if we click add, we have a couple of actions. Perform request lets us pick a request to run. That's the one we want. We can also set the value of a cookie, set the value of a variable, navigate to a specific page or link, or run function. Also very powerful. That lets us set up our action entirely with JavaScript. We want to go with perform request, and the request we want to run is Airtable create story record. Okay, now everything should be linked up. To get this event to load, we will refresh our canvas and I'll come up with a slightly longer prompt to test that 30 character JavaScript that we created. We did just have a major storm that knocked out a lot of the electrical infrastructure, and the leprechaun part is me just stereotyping my own race. Why not? Okay, now we should be able to generate our story and the record should be automatically added to Airtable. We can obviously check that by just going to Airtable, but this is a good time to look at the log. I'm going to clear this and I'm going to generate my story. So we can see that our Grok request starts and completes. Our Airtable request starts and then completes. And over here, we can see that it has indeed submitted. So if I widen this up, we can see that our JavaScript worked. It shortens this down to a max of 30 characters. It enters our prompt. Our temperature and our max tokens have changed. The created date obviously changes and the response has changed as well. And that, dear viewers, is an introduction to CRUD with Airtable, specifically to the create part. A very quick recap. You will need to create an Airtable account if you don't already have one. You will make a workspace and you will create a base inside of that. You will then set the different fields or columns to set which information you want to store and what type of information you will have. Over in Wized, you will need to link Airtable as an app. That's a pretty automated process, very easy to do. And from there, you will be creating a request. You will select Airtable as the app, and for the method, you will use create item. You will select the base and the table inside the base that you want to use, and you will then link up the different fields. And I will provide this JavaScript in the clonable so that you'll be able to clone this project and take a look at it. We also created a variable so that we can change the model we are using in the future. And we linked that to the Grok create story request and also to our Airtable request so that we can change the variable once and have it update in many places. Lastly, we created an event. That event triggers when the Grok create story request finishes, and it is conditional. It will only fire if the request was okay, if it was successful. If it was, the action that we perform is our Airtable create story record. Now, whenever a new story gets generated, it automatically gets added to Airtable. And that brings us to the end of this video. In the next video, we are going to cover read. We will make a new page in our project that is going to display all of the stories that were generated in the past. That's coming up next. See you there.